This technology is showing me who's boss, huh? Okay. Let us see. Let us see. Yeah, nobody's watching yet. That sucks. Yeah, nobody's watching yet. Ah, somebody's watching. Hang on 1 minute. I will be with you. Just trying to sort out some technology. Let's see. Hang on 1 minute. I will be with you. Just trying to sort out some technology. Let's see. Hang on 1 minute. I will be with you. Okay. Just trying to sort out some technology. Let's see. Okay. Hang on 1 minute. I will be with you. Okay. Is anybody watching? This is so confusing. Okay. Okay. Nobody. Okay. Is anybody watching? This is so confusing. Okay. Okay. Nobody. Okay. Is anybody watching? Okay. I'll be with you in a moment, people. Just trying to sort out a big blunder that I just made. Get everybody on the same page. Let's see. But I do apologize for the inconvenience. And thank you for being with me, whoever you are. I'll be with you in a moment, people. Just trying to sort out a big blunder that I just made. Get everybody on the same page. But I do apologize for the inconvenience. And thank you for being with me, whoever you are. I'll be with you in a moment, people. Just trying to sort out a big blunder that I just made. Get everybody on the same page. But I do apologize for the inconvenience. Okay. Thank you for being with me, whoever you are. I'll be with you in a moment, people. Just trying to sort out a big blunder that I just made. get everybody on the same page. Right. I think let's give people a few minutes to find their way onto this page. Apologize for the inconvenience. Okay. Thank you for being with me, whoever you are. I'll be with you in a moment, people. Yeah, let's give people a few minutes to find their way to this stream. Yeah, people a few minutes to find their way onto this page. Apologize for the inconvenience. Okay. People a few minutes to find their way to this stream. But in any case, whoever you are who's viewing this, one person who's viewing this, I hope you're doing well. As I'm sure you can already tell by now, I've never done this before, so I do apologize about these mistakes. I'm an up and starting YouTuber, so I'll get better at this as time goes. I hope, we can only hope. But yes, so since there is only one person on this thing, let's see, I think I'll wait for like 2 or 3 more minutes and then I'll get started. Yeah, 2 or 3 more minutes, then we can start. Yeah, and please do share the link to anyone who might be watching. I can see Uso Sotamana. Yo, bro, thanks for joining us. Let's see, I still have one viewer. So I think like in the next minute, one viewer or not, I am going with this thing. Yeah, so in the meantime, I can probably just elaborate a little bit on the discussion points for joining us. Say a few things about, I still have one, why I decided to talk about what I am going to talk about. So did God create the world? So I was taking a shower this morning, and for some reason that's the thought that was on my mind. So I had this idea that, hey, I might as well go for it, just do a live stream, and to use YouTube instead of Facebook, because I'm trying to sort of draw people to my content here on this YouTube channel. So please do check out the rest of this channel. Okay, it's on my mind. Maybe the last thing I can say before I jump straight into my mini presentation here is, so if you're following my Politics of Genesis series, I still have 2 episodes planned for that one. We've already covered the Enuma Elish. We've already covered Genesis chapter 1, at least the first 25 verses of Genesis chapter 1 with 2 videos. So the next video I'm going to get into will basically cover Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 and verse 27, maybe even verse 28. Those 3 verses, the creation of human beings. Then the episode after that will cover the Sabbath, or Shabbat if you're Jewish, and how that, you know, connects with the theme of the politics of Genesis. So these last 2 episodes that I'm going to make will more explicitly deal with the question of the politics of Genesis. So yeah, don't miss out on that. I'm still busy with them, still writing. I haven't started recording anything, haven't started editing anything. But if you subscribe to this channel, you will get the information and everything. And if you're my friend on Facebook or following me, whatever, on Facebook, I will announce it there, or, you know, share a link there as well. Okay, I think I've waited enough. I'm just going to jump into it. I can see that I at least have 2 people who are watching, so that's good. Yeah, so I'm just going to jump straight into the content of today's presentation. Did God create the world? Yeah, did God create the world? What does that question even mean? Does God need the world? Does the world need God? those are the questions I want to answer. I've made a few notes for myself because I have this horrible habit of digressing, and with each digression I sort of forget the point I was making. So these notes are just to keep me on track, okay? And the last thing I should do is probably apologize if you hear any noises. I mean, it's Saturday today, we might be on lockdown, but my neighbors get excited when it's Saturday. Friday, Saturday, they get excited, not so much on Sunday. So you might hear some loud music and laughter in the background and people chatting. Don't let that disturb you. Try to focus on my voice. Okay, with all of those formal things out of the way, and again, I do apologize for being late, and yeah, technology showed me that I am its child. It is not my child, I am its child. It humbled me greatly so yeah, but anyway, we'll get used to this, we'll get better at this. So straight into the topic. Did God create the world? Did God create the world? So here's the thing. I think in order to understand, or in order to even approach an answer to this question, we need to sort out a few things. There are a couple of words in this question which can be very loaded, theologically or otherwise, or philosophically. And if we don't share a common understanding of what these words mean, the answers provided to the question can confuse us. So these words are God. What do we mean by God? In as much as we, like most cultures, if not all, have some sort of conception of the divine and of God, we don't share an understanding of God. That's why there are different religions. And even within religions, there are different understandings of God. For instance, you get mainstream Muslims who have one understanding of God in the Quran. Then you get ISIS, and they have a different understanding of God in the Quran. So, and then you have, even in Judaism, one religion where people don't share like a common understanding of what God is. Even in Christianity, we have so many churches, so many denominations, so many different beliefs. So what do we mean by God? We have to at least come to some sort of understanding on that. God is too big a question to address in one video, and God is not the main, like who God is and what we mean by God is not the main question of today's video, but I'll touch on it for the sake of common understanding. And create, what do we mean by create? Believe it or not, even amongst Christians, there are different ideas about creation. You have people who believe in creationism, that God created the world in 6 days. You have theistic evolutionary Christians who believe that God used evolution to create the world. So what does that even mean? That one is not so important for today's video, because both of those views accept that God created the world. But here's one which I would say is the most important thing we need to clarify for today's video. World. What do we mean by the world? The thing that God creates. How do we understand the world? The very existence of different world views means that people don't mean the same thing when they say the world or when they think about the world. So we need to come to some sort of common understanding of that. So let's clarify a little bit of those things, and then we'll come to the question more directly. So what does this question even mean? What is the world? Okay, so generally speaking, this is a gross generalization, so forgive me for it. But generally speaking, people throughout human history have tended to understand the world in two different ways. The first one, I'll start with the one that we're most familiar with, is the world as a place for things. The world is a place for objects. The world as a place for things. So this is the worldview that is assumed in the hard sciences. So in biology, in physics, in cosmology, it's an empiricistic. No, that's not proper English. It's empiricism, basically. It's naturalistic. It's the understanding that the world is a thing that you can touch. It's something you can take in with your senses. Something you can experience with your eyes and your ears. And if your eyes and ears are limited, you can use certain devices to enhance your hearing or your seeing. But it's something you can take in with your senses. So the world is a place of things. That's one way of understanding the world. And as I've said, it's given rise to science. The second way that the world has generally tended to be understood, and this is the more primordial, the more ancient way of understanding the world is to understand the world as a forum for action. So what do I mean by this? Well, it's a long chain of meaning. First of all, according to this way of understanding the world is not actually seen as a place for things. Yes, the world does have things in it, but that's not where the meaning of the world is derived. The world is primarily seen as something that has meaning. The world is primarily seen as something that has value. Then the value that the world has and the things and the value that the things in the world have inform the way that people act towards those things and to the world. And that is why, according to that second way of seeing the world is a forum for action. Okay, very theoretical. Let's make this practical with a little bit of an illustration that I found in a book that I was reading the other day. So this illustration, if done well, will explain both of these concepts, but it will also explain that there is never a point in our lives where we have to choose between one way of seeing the world, either as a place for things, or the other, which is the world as a forum for action. But in some dualistic manner, we use both at the same time. They both function simultaneously. So here's the example, or here's the illustration, the parable, if you please. Imagine a baby girl who just learned to walk. I would say she's probably about 1 year old, just learned to walk, exploring the world. And anybody who's been around little children and babies would know that they're eager to explore the world, always picking things up, always touching things, putting things in their mouth. So it's no different for this baby girl. She's walking around for the first time in her short existence, picking things up when she can, putting them in her mouth to get the feel of them, the taste that they have. And as she's exploring the world, which is her mother's living room, she walks up to the coffee table. And on top of the coffee table, there's an expensive glass vase, beautiful in all of these rainbow colors. And she walks up to the coffee table and she places her hand on the glass vase. And she can feel that it's cold to the touch. It's very cold, smooth, hard. And she can feel those things, and she can also see that it has bright colors and it's beautiful. Interesting, fascinating, captivating in some sense. She can't smell anything from it. Notice that this girl is experiencing an object in the world according to the first way of understanding the world that I described, the world as a place for things. She's only able to see this vase as a thing, as an object with its physical markers, how it smells, how it feels to the touch. Is it smooth? Is it rough? All those things. That's the way that she's able to interpret the world around her and the objects that she engages in this world around her. But as she's doing this, as she's touching this glass vase, trying to even pick it up, her mother notices, and her mother goes crazy and rushes over and takes the vase and puts it far away from the baby, and takes the baby and to another room completely and says, "Never again touch that vase, my baby girl." Whether or not the baby understands those words, is not for me to decide. The answer is probably no. But the point is, the mother is looking at the same vase in a different way from the baby. The mother is not just looking at the vase as a physical object which she can touch and feel, whether it's smooth or rough or soft or cold or warm, but she's also looking at it as something that has meaning, as something that has value. But the value and the meaning that she ascribes to the vase is not inherent, is not physically inherent, there's no physical quality of the vase that necessarily leads to the vase having value. So these are the two ways of seeing the world, and this baby girl is probably 1 year old and she's introduced to both of them at the same time. Clearly there's something about the vase that I did not understand, otherwise my mother would not have gone so crazy. So another example is human beings. How do you look at human beings? You can look at human beings according to the first way of interpreting the world. You can look at human beings as a conglomeration of cells. You can look at human beings as these organisms which have bones and arteries and blood flowing in those arteries, and brains and eyes and all of that. But that physical description of what a human being is doesn't necessarily lead you to the conclusion that a human being is something objectively valuable. So another way of looking at a human being is that, no, a human being is something sacred. You'll hear Christians say human beings were created in the image of God, or what have you, that human beings are something sacred, something important. Therefore, you shouldn't hurt human beings. You shouldn't steal from them. You shouldn't murder them. You shouldn't abuse them. It's the idea that human rights are founded on. Why do humans have rights? There's nothing inherent in our biology that leads to the conclusion that we have rights. Yet we have the concept of human rights. The concept of human rights is not derived from a scientific perspective of the world. Or, let me say, the concept of human rights is not derived from a way of seeing the world as a forum of things or a place for things. The concept of human rights is derived from a view of the world as a forum of action, where things have meaning and things have value. Then based on the value and meaning they have, we act according to the value. We try to figure out what is the appropriate way in which we should act in relation to this object in the world. So when we talk about whether or not God created the world, and the claims that the Bible makes about God creating the world, that's the first thing we need to sort out. Is the Bible speaking from the perspective of a view of the world as a forum for action, or is it speaking from the perspective of a view of the world as a place for things and objects? So, right off the bat, I'm going to say, number one, the Bible is not doing science. The Bible is not talking about the world as a sphere, or rather, let me say, as a place for things. The Bible isn't about God going around, and it's not about the physical qualities of the world. The statement that from the Bible that God created the world is not actually interested primarily in the physical attributes of the world. Of course, you can't divorce the value of the world from the physical thing that is the world. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that these things were divorced. I mean, when the writer of Genesis chapter 1, the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1, talks about the ocean, or talks about the earth, or talks about animals being created, he's actually talking about things that physically exist, but he's not talking about them as purely from a physical perspective, but talking about them in relation to a God who makes them. So, okay, let's crack this open a little bit. What does it mean to say that God created the world? What does it mean to say that God created the world? Which will lead us to the answer to the question we asked first. Did God create the world? Well, look at Genesis chapter 1. And if you've been following my series on the politics of Genesis, you will have noticed that I haven't made mention of science even once. In fact, I haven't made mention of the usual creationistic arguments that God created the world in 6 literal days, in 6 literal consecutive 24-hour periods. I haven't invoked any of that theological drama or theological debate, but instead we started off with a video in which we briefly introduced the Enuma Elish, which is a different creation narrative from a different part of the same world that the Bible was written in. And we noticed that the Bible shares a lot of tropes with the Enuma Elish, to the extent that you could read the Bible, or at least Genesis chapter 1 in the Bible, as a response to the creation narrative we find in the Enuma Elish. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're going to have to watch the videos in my series on the politics of Genesis. When I'm done with the stream, I'll put links to those videos in the description box. But in any case, the point that I'm getting to is that the Bible shares a cosmology with the Enuma Elish. It shares an understanding of the world, which demonstrates that the world that the Bible is speaking about is the same world that the Enuma Elish seems to be talking about. In any case, I mentioned that point to say that the Bible is looking at the world as something with value. The value that the world has in the Enuma Elish is that the world is something that was founded on violence and state superiority, and that it is something that will be sustained through the same means. And it is the sort of ideology that would support the notion of an aggressive police force to subjugate its citizens, the citizens of whatever nation we're talking about, into doing what the ruling elite would want them to do. But the view we get of the world from Genesis chapter 1 is that the world is something that God created without violence. It's a different way of understanding the world. It's injecting or infusing a different strand of meaning to the world than that which people in the time that narrative was written would have understood. So the world is something with meaning according to Genesis chapter 1. And what is the meaning of the world? The meaning of the world is that God created the world, and that God created the world peacefully and not violently. So the world is something that God made, and therefore the world is something valuable, at least by virtue of the fact that it comes from God. That is what the statement God created the world means, at least at some quasi-phenomenological level in the book of Genesis. It means that the world has value because God made the world. In other words, it's not a statement that is about science. This is over 2,000 years before anything that approximates modern day science even existed. So clearly this is a different language game altogether. This is a different discourse altogether. There is no way of destroying the meaning of Genesis. There's no better way to destroy the meaning of Genesis chapter 1 than to project questions of science and evolution and all of that modern day cosmology onto the text, as if whoever wrote it was writing something that would be publishable in a journal publication today and would be peer reviewed by other scientists. That is not what is happening in the book of Genesis. What this person was doing was, they had a sense that God made the world, number one. The primary purpose of Genesis chapter 1 wasn't even to tell us how God made the world, because we, as I've already shown, this person is not like trying to do some sort of historical recovery of God's act of creating the world, but is actually responding and disagreeing to an opinion that he found in the world he lived in, which stated that God created the world through violence. And he says, no, that's not how God created the world. This is how God created the world, as a way of saying, this is the value that the world has, and this is what it means to say God created the world, not what you say. Okay, so let's come to today's world. Did God create the world? Can we believe that God created the world? And what would we mean by the statement that God created the world? Well, I think God did create the world. And at a quasi-phenomenological level, the most basic thing, the baseline or essential meaning of this statement is that the world is something that has value. Okay, let's break it down a little bit. If you are a person who believes in justice, be it justice for women, justice for black people, justice for, I don't know, whoever needs justice. If you're a person who thinks the project of justice in whatever capacity is a worthwhile endeavor, then you think the world is valuable in some sense, because you think the world is worth fixing. If you're a person who believes in democracy, then there is some sense in which you think the world has value, because you think the world is something worth fixing. There is nothing inherent in the physical makeup of the world that inherently implies that the world is worth fixing up and that the world is worth making into a better place. Nothing at all. So the belief that the world is worth fixing up and that the world is worth making into something just is not a belief that draws from the same sort of philosophical worldview that science does. It's not a belief that draws on the idea of the world as a place with things that you can measure and sense and feel. It's a view that's derived from the world as something meaningful. So, at least at a phenomenological level, if you think the world is something worth fixing, there is a sense in which that your beliefs about the world overlap with the beliefs that whoever wrote Genesis 1 had. You might consider yourself an atheist, but even in your atheism, there's a sense in which the thing that matters to you, which is the way that the world has meaning and value, overlaps with what whoever wrote Genesis 1 thought about the meaning and value the world had. So the statement that God created the world can be translated in the modern day as the world is a meaningful and valuable place. And if you think the world is a meaningful and valuable place, there is a sense in which you're not an atheist, even if it's only at a phenomenological level. So, do I believe that God created the world? Yes, I do. And what I mean by that, at least at a baseline level, the baseline of what I mean by that is the world is a valuable place. We can stack on other things on top of that, okay? And you might not agree with the things I stack on top of that. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But at its depths, the belief that God created the world is a belief that the world is worthwhile, that the world is meaningful. And if you believe that the world is meaningful, there is a sense in which you are not an atheist, even if it's only a phenomenological sense. And maybe you don't believe there's a being in the world who did things, some super being in the sky or whatever. Maybe you don't believe that, but maybe you do believe that the world is valuable. Then what you mean whenever you cry out for justice and democracy is exactly what the writer of Genesis 1 meant when they said God created the world. You and that writer meant that the world is worthwhile. Okay, so that's the first thing. So when I say God did create the world, this is not a propositional truth about the past, even if I think that. It's actually fundamentally a statement about the value the world has, and that will inform the actions that I will take in the world. It will inform my politics, it will inform my social relations, it will inform my personal view on what the health policy should be. So, for instance, I think we should have free healthcare for everyone, and that has to do with me thinking that human beings are created in the image of God. And a socialist or communist who also thinks we should have free healthcare for everyone, but doesn't believe in the existence of God. What I mean when I say human beings were created in the image of God, and what they mean when they say human beings should have every human being should have free healthcare, is at least at the level of meaning and value the same thing. You might not attach that to a being, but at least at some quasi-phenomenological level, they have the same root. Okay, I really belabored that one. I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker with the following question. So, did God create the world? Yes. What does that even mean? It means the world is worthwhile. It means the world is a meaningful place. So if you think the world is meaningful, maybe reconsider, if you're an atheist, reconsider distancing yourself from God talk, from theology, because perhaps you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. Man, it got dark while I was talking, so I'm going to be struggling to see some of these notes. What is the next thing I'm supposed to be? Okay, maybe before I move on, let me say this. The narrative of Genesis chapter 1, the interesting thing about it is that it is tied to a world that we no longer recognize, to a way of seeing the world which is, I hope the way I'm going to put it won't put you off, but an outdated way of seeing the world. What do I mean by that? I mean that in its narratival structure, this is an outdated narrative. This is an outdated thing in its narratival structure. But the message that gets itself communicated through the narrative is timeless or is ever fresh. So what do I mean when I say there's a sense in which this narrative is outdated? Well, number one, there's a historical distance between us and the narrative. It had a historical context which is lost to us and is gone forever. It's never coming back. We live in a different historical reality. So that's the first way in which it's outdated. The second way in which it's outdated is the cosmology that you find when you read Genesis chapter 1 is obviously a very different cosmology to the cosmology that we have. Let me give you a few examples. If you read Genesis 1, you get the sense that the world isn't a sphere. It's not a sphere. Whereas, according to the breakthroughs of scientific discovery, we know for a fact that the world is a sphere. And when I say we, I mean those of us who are not flat earthers. So what do I mean when I say in Genesis 1 the world is not a sphere? Well, the first thing that God does is he splits the deep in two when God creates in Genesis chapter 1. Splits it in two, and the top half of this deep or this ocean forms the heavens, and the bottom part forms the waters down here on earth. And then God creates a dome between the top part of the deep and the bottom part of the deep. And that dome is the sky, or is the atmosphere. It's the air that we breathe. So in other words, according to the cosmology of Genesis chapter 1, there's an ocean above us, above the sky. There's an ocean. And according to this cosmology, there's also an ocean underground, which God put there. In fact, when you read the story of Noah's flood, the ocean above, God creates a wall and the water, a hole, and the waters from the ocean above come crashing down. And then God cracks open the ground and the waters from the ocean below come welling out. And this is not a cosmology that is recognizable today by modern day scientific standards, because people have gone up to the sky and there is indeed no ocean up there. There is no water in the sky. There is no water under the ground. So this is obviously a very different cosmology, which is completely out of step with modern day scientific cosmology. Let me give you another example. In Genesis chapter 1's creation narrative, God creates the earth before God creates the sun. God creates light before God creates the sun. God creates light on day 1, but creates the sun and the moon and the stars on day 4. God creates the earth and creates trees and creates creates an environment in the first 3 days before there's even a sun. How on earth would trees and vegetation survive without the sun? This is obviously a very different cosmology to the cosmology that we recognize. Whatever the author of Genesis 1 was doing, it was not science. And that doesn't diminish from the quality of Genesis 1. That's my argument here. So that's what I meant when I said the narrative is outdated, but the message of the narrative is not outdated. It is timeless and it is ever fresh. So what was the author of Genesis 1 doing? First of all, he had a sense about God. We believe that the Bible is inspired by God. And so he had a sense about God and about the world in relation to God, which he got from God through inspiration. And to communicate this in the context of a Babylonian exile, he used what was at his disposal to say what he thinks about God and what he thinks about the world. And that's how we got. So he took the aspects of the world that he lived in, such as its cosmology, and constructed a creation narrative which tells us about the God that he believes actually created the world. I know this is some really controversial stuff. If my elder sees this, where my local church membership is, I could get disciplined for saying such things. But yes, so what are we supposed to do today? We can't just graft Genesis chapter 1 into our world without some interpretation, because there is a sense in which it's completely outdated, and people will dismiss it as a fairy tale without giving it a fair hearing to hear what the message of the passage is, and we will be guilty for leading them to that conclusion because we didn't do our due diligence ourselves. Well, one thing we can do is we can look at what are the key beats of Genesis chapter 1. Well, there's a God who creates out of chaos. The chaos being that things were not differentiated. God has, you notice in Genesis chapter 1 that God creates by separating. He separates the water from below from the water above. He creates human beings but separates. There's male and female. God creates order through separation. God even separates days. There are days which are normal, and then there's a holy day which God sets aside and sanctifies. God separates even amongst animals. There's male and female. God creates by differentiation. You see this even when God creates light. God says, let there be light, and there was light. Then the very next verse says, then God separated the light from the darkness. So when God said, let there be light, the idea was that light and darkness were the same thing, were fused in some sense. And God creates order by differentiating between these muddled things, by putting hard barriers between them. And basically the idea is that God creates order where there's chaos. That's the idea. That's a strong idea we get from this creation story. And it would have been useful in Babylon because Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Jerusalem and the holy city would have put the Jewish kingdom in a state of chaos. They no longer had a king, and the monarchy was the center of their political identity and their social identity. No king means no Judaism, means no Jewish homeland. It means no Jewish national identity. No temple means no Jewish religion. This was chaos. They lost the temple, they lost the Ark of the Covenant, they lost the king. This was chaos. And that was the age in which many Jews spread to different parts of the world. The age of the Jewish diaspora begins with Babylon. Chaos, but they talk about a God who creates order out of chaos in that moment as a way of saying that if anything, God is a God who can bring us together, reform us, and give us order, give us an identity. And how can we use that in our world today? So I live in South Africa. I'm an African and I'm a Christian. I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, and I'm an African in South Africa. And the way that there are two ways that I've discovered through reading that we can apply this in the African context. The first way is in a traditional sense. I'll explain what I mean by that, and it doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. But anyway, the second way is in a modernist sense. Okay, let me start with the traditional sense. What I mean by traditional is we live in a context that is highly influenced by African traditional religion. And even Christians in the context we live in continue to see the world through the lens of an African traditional worldview. Okay? And in an African traditional worldview, there is a dynamistic understanding of the world. At least in Southern Africa. When you go to Northern Africa and Central Africa, you find a animistic understanding of the world. The two are different, and I'm not going to get into too much detail, but to explain what a dynamistic understanding of the world is, here's a layman's explanation. A dynamistic understanding of the world means there are these, should I say, metaphysical powers in the world which certain people who are recognized by the communities and are people of rapport or people, respected people, have ways in which to channel this power. So this dynamistic power is itself neutral. It's not good, it's not evil. But certain people can channel it in good ways and certain people can channel it in evil ways. So an ancestor is called upon to channel dynamistic power in the favor of his progeny, in positive ways, in other words. But a sorcerer or a witch would use the same dynamistic power to, ukutakata, to bewitch people. Yes, that's the word, to bewitch people. That's the understanding we have in Africa. And this leads to a lot of fear. People turn to sacred charms and sacred things, ceremonies and rituals out of fear that someone could use this dynamistic power against them. There is an element of chaos there because this dynamistic power is all over the show for the taking. The person with the right sort of connection to it can use it to your detriment. And this leads to fear and uncertainty. We could take the principles of Genesis chapter 1 and inject them into this African world and say, no, but to say that God created the world means God is able to bring order to this disorderly world where we're afraid of dynamistic powers of witchcraft. God is the one who can bring the sort of order that would inhibit us from having to be afraid from these powers which are all over the show. God is the ultimate source of reality. God is the ultimate authority, and so there is no power that can overwhelm God, be it dynamistic or otherwise. Okay, to those of you who are watching, I'm having a crisis here. My laptop battery is low, and if I plug in the charger, it's going to make this really disturbing noise. So that means that I'm not going to be able to go too long with this present. I'm probably going to stop at the halfway mark, and at a later stage, maybe next week, next Saturday, I'll probably do a part 2 live stream. But let me at least wrap up what I'm on. So God is a God who can deal with the disorder that is introduced into your life out of fear of dynamistic forces. That is a legitimate application of Genesis chapter 1 into the African context. It's not about whether or not there was evolution, you know. It really isn't. It's about God creating the world and injecting meaning into it and being the ultimate source of reality and therefore being the one in control of our destinies. Okay, I said the second way in which I would apply it is in terms of a modernist view. And I think when you look at the history of Southern Africa, especially with the arrival of the colonizers, you could say it's a history of transformation and change, for better or for worse, where people were becoming less traditional and more modernist, or both at the same time. People have become more modernized. People use cell phones. Look at us right now. We're having a discussion through YouTube, you know, through the internet and through computers and cell phones. And the chaos that comes through the modernist world is that the modernist world is destroying the world. We've all heard of climate change. We've all heard of global warming and the detrimental effect it will have in terms of heating up the Earth's temperature and the melting of the ice caps in the two poles. And so that is chaos. But if God is the source of reality, in the name of God, we can revolt against that sort of chaos. Look, I don't have any hard and fast interpretations, any hard and fast ways in which we can work these principles from Genesis 1 into our world. But I just use these two examples to sort of get your imaginations flowing. Let's do what the authors of Genesis did. They looked at the world they lived in. They were fully embedded in the language of that world and its cosmology and its philosophy and all that. And they spoke about God according to the promptings of the Holy Spirit in the world they lived in. Let's do the same thing. Let's not be afraid about it, okay? I think I'm going to end it there, okay? Let me maybe take a look at some of the comments here on the chats. Maybe there's a question or two before my battery dies. Again, my battery is low and I don't want to plug in the charger because it's going to make this really irritating noise and it's going to diminish the quality of this recording. Okay, let's see. We are here. Justice, hello science, okay? Okay, so interesting perspective. Cosmological distinctions make it difficult to perceive the world the same when existing at different times. Yes, I'm glad you see that. I'm glad you see that point that I was making there. And it goes beyond cosmological distinctions. There are even, I would say, religious things about the world of the Bible that are outdated, for better or for worse. There are even social norms. Let me give you a few examples. In Leviticus, I think it's chapter 15, it's very clear that when a woman is, going through her periods, according to Leviticus 15, she shouldn't share a bed with her husband, and she shouldn't go to the tent of meeting. In our modern day context, we would say a woman on her period shouldn't go to church and shouldn't sleep in the same bed as her husband. None of us live according to that anymore. Another example is in Leviticus. It says you shouldn't plant two crops in the same field. So if you have a field for maize, you should only plant maize in that field. Then in a different field, you can go and plant whatever other crop you want to plant, your cabbages and whatnot. It's another, I don't even know why that mattered, but it's a relic of a bygone day, and there was a reason why it worked in the days of Leviticus. It's not so practical today. Especially think of people who live in locations and in townships who have small space, and a garden is usually like a tire or a little old bathtub or something, and they plant stuff in there. You're going to tell them that they should find another space to plant a different crop. Where are they going to get that space? They don't even have land. You know what I mean? So that's one example, but it's a weak example. I thought of it on the spot. But yes, the world of the Bible is a completely different world from our world. But the message of the Bible is relevant to that world of the Bible and to our world, because the message of the Bible was about shalom. This is a Hebrew word that means peace. But I've read a book on shalom, and the book argues that the Hebrew word shalom doesn't just mean peace, as in don't disturb me, I won't disturb you, don't abuse me, I won't abuse you, but it means comprehensive well-being. Not just for you, but for the world. Comprehensive well-being, everyone having or existing in well-being. That is what the word shalom means. And the Bible meets different people in different places, in different situations. And there's one objective, and that is comprehensive well-being, shalom. But according to the uniqueness of the context that the Word of God meets, it has to bring about shalom in a unique way, in a different way than it would in a different context. You can't treat different ailments in the same way. So if I go to a doctor and I say I have a stomach ache, when in fact I have a headache, whatever medication I get for the stomach ache will do nothing for the headache. And in the same way, whatever works in Europe won't necessarily work in Africa. I've already mentioned 2 reasons why. Europe doesn't have the traditionalist backdrop that we have. They don't even experience modernism in the way that we do. We experience modernization as an encroachment, which is not the European experience of it. So how do you talk about God in an explicitly non-European context? And how do you talk about God in an explicitly non-Israelite context? So okay, I really have to go. My battery is drastically low, but I want to thank those of you who joined. I do apologize for messing it up, mucking it up at the beginning there. I'll get better at this as time goes. I really will, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I think I'll probably just do the next half of this tomorrow, because I can't wait until next week. So tomorrow I'm going to do another live stream session, probably a bit earlier in the day. I don't know. I'm going to post it on my Facebook. And this time around, I'm not going to make the same stupid mistake I made today. So thank you for joining. Enjoy your evenings. And I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.